Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our monthly webinar series, this time on language learning and cultural competence. My name is Ken Bellinger, and I'm the Managing Director for TMC, a Berlitz company. I will be your moderator for today's session, and my colleague Lakeisha Ward and I will handle all of the questions that you type into the questions box. We are pleased to partner today with Jeff Santilli. Jeff is the country manager of instruction for Berlitz North America, and he's been very instrumental in working with us to integrate cultural competence with language learning into the curriculum. Just a few housekeeping items we like to go over with you. First, in order to reduce background noise during the presentation, all participants will be muted throughout today's webinar. Second, we invite you to use the interactive nature of this interface, so at any time you may type a question in the questions box. We will reserve some time at the end for moderated question and answer sessions. Third, we will be recording today's session, and after the webinar, we will share the link with you by email to the email ID you used at registration. Finally, we're letting you know up front that when we switch presenters, you may see a pause in the presentation, so please stick with us on that point. We appreciate that you are here with us today, so let's get started. We'd like to start by understanding who's on the line with us today. Please let us know what your organizational role is by choosing from the following options: talent management, organizational development, training, business line leader, or other. If you choose the option other, please type your role in the Q&A box. All right, well, let's see, for our poll today, we see that most of our participants today are in training. There are a couple in other. And for the other parts, we have talent management, organizational development, and business line leader. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Jeff, and Jeff will show us and give us a few ideas and pointers on how we can integrate cultural competence into language learning, especially with the training part, as most of you are in the training area. Jeff?
Thank you, Ken. Welcome to our webinar entitled Impact, Language Learning and Cultural Competence. As Ken mentioned, my name is Jeff Santilli, and I look forward to exploring this topic with you today. So I'm the manager of facilitation and instruction in North America for Berlitz, TMC's sister company. And just so that you're familiar with a bit of my background, I've taught English as a second language in Japan, in Mexico with Berlitz, and in the US with Berlitz as well. I've worked for Berlitz as an English and Japanese instructor, as an instructional manager in various language centers in Berlitz, Mexico, and I've worked in other departments such as Berlitz Cultural Consulting, delivering and supporting our Berlitz Business Communication Solutions, which I'll talk about today. And some of you may have attended TMC webinars in which I gave Cultural Navigator demonstrations. Through my experiences in these various countries, departments, and markets, I've been able to become familiar with the objectives language learners have and the challenges that they face on their learning paths. Today, I'd like to share some of this information with you as we look at how language and culture intertwine and how language learners can optimize their training in order to meet their specific needs in a global business environment. We'll spend the next 30 minutes exploring the importance of personalized language training and how culture plays a part in every language program, whether a student is a true beginner or at an advanced level. We'll also look at how different Berlitz and TMC solutions can play a part in this training. So I'd like to start with a bit of background on Berlitz and the Berlitz Method, as I realize some of you may be more aware of our TMC solutions. As you may know, Berlitz has been in the language education industry for over 135 years. We teach any language our students are interested in learning, and English is the most commonly taught language worldwide at Berlitz. Here in the US, the second most common language is Spanish. No matter what language a student is learning with us, we always instruct using the Berlitz Method, which is interactive, dynamic, and focuses most on the development of speaking and listening skills, with reading and writing as support. Every Berlitz lesson focuses on a balance of accuracy and fluency in speaking, so that our students are speaking correctly, but also independently and naturally. Too much of a focus on accuracy can lead to speakers over-monitoring their language output, which generally leads to a slower speaking speed. Needless to say, this can affect the impression that someone is making when speaking the language, even if they have a good level. On the other hand, too much of a focus on fluency can lead to a natural flow, but with many distracting mistakes. Balancing these two aspects leads to confident speakers who make minimal mistakes. Every Berlitz lesson is also personalized for the student's learning preferences and personal context. For example, someone learning Spanish for business purposes will have very different objectives and needs than someone learning Spanish for an upcoming trip. Also, as we'll explore today, someone learning Spanish for business purposes in Mexico could need different vocabulary, expressions, and other language points from someone learning Spanish for business purposes in Spain, for example. Identifying our students' goals and personalizing the delivery of the lessons is a key aspect of Berlitz classes, and the relevance of the materials and activities in class ensure that our students are engaged and therefore learning at a quicker pace. While the key principles of the Berlitz Method have remained the same over 135 years, it goes without saying that many factors have changed since 1878. In a more globalized world, we are finding our students are coming to us with different needs than before. For example, many of our students are beginning with a much higher language level than they once did. This applies for all languages, but especially for English. Whether through formal education, business experience, traveling, or interacting with international friends via social media, many of our students are starting off at a more advanced level than they used to. According to a study by The Economist, 25% of global employees are expected to speak a language in business that is not their native tongue. While we've always had many students that have come to us for business language needs, these objectives have changed over the years. Since many students who come to us with an upper intermediate to advanced level are frequently exposed to the language at work, even if they're not living in an English-speaking country, we've changed our offerings in order to better suit the needs of this type of learner. For example, we've heard many more requests to incorporate content regarding small talk and how to build a rapport, how to network, and even more of a focus on the appropriate level of formality or informality in different business and social situations. This is really where culture comes into play. As I'm sure you know, being able to speak a given language in a business environment can't just be a matter of translating directly from your native language. There is much more to consider, and a large part of that comes from cultural differences. When we're speaking another language in a business environment, we need to not only consider points such as grammar and vocabulary, but also much more complicated matters related to communication style. Once a language learner reaches an upper intermediate to advanced level of a language, the traditional language points remain important, but they must also be aware of cultural points that affect communication in that language, and appropriately incorporate them when conveying their message. To give some real-life examples to illustrate this, I'd like to share some comments I've received from incoming students over the years. One student told me, "I'm very comfortable presenting numbers and giving the reasons behind these numbers, but when I need to persuade the audience, I don't feel confident, and I don't usually get the results that I want." Another student said, "I consider myself a good leader in my home country, but I've been struggling with giving feedback to employees since I moved here. It's a sensitive situation, and I need to be better at giving feedback to employees in English." I've also heard, "I can lead and participate in meetings face-to-face, but teleconferences are very different. I don't know how to interpret silence on the line, and I always get nervous. I can't tell if they're understanding me or not, and I usually participate less than in face-to-face meetings." And finally, another comment from a student was, "Email writing can be easy because I have more time to think about my choice of words, but my messages are usually much longer than my colleagues. I don't know how I should be writing emails in the US." So with these comments in mind, Berlitz developed BBCS, Berlitz Business Communication Solutions. Berlitz Business Communication Solutions is specifically designed for upper intermediate to advanced learners of English or Spanish and is a bridge between language and culture. This program allows a student, whether they've studied with us or elsewhere, the opportunity to apply what they've learned over the years and fine-tune it. Participants in BBCS have a good grasp of vocabulary and grammar, but what they really need is a communication trainer that can help them communicate in complicated business situations so that they are expressing their ideas in the most effective and appropriate way possible. In other words, they are applying their language knowledge and skills and making them more culturally appropriate for the workplace, or rather the global workplace. This is why we call our business communication program the bridge between language and culture. It's not a traditional language program, but rather it's focused on that point where language and culture meet so that non-native speakers can be as successful as possible in communicating in these situations. I'll be giving more information as to the specific modules available in BBCS in a moment, but first I'd like to share the overall objectives of this program. As you can see, BBCS is much more focused on the fluency and confidence side of speaking a language. Through their previous language training programs, students have developed their accuracy, and by the time someone reaches a higher level, often their level of fluency and confidence is what's getting in the way of communicating more clearly. In BBCS, participants are given the opportunity to gain confidence and fluency through very extensive and realistic simulations, which I'll talk about more shortly. But first, I'd like to think about presentation, which leads us to our second poll question. I'd like to ask you, would you be comfortable delivering a presentation in a second language? I'm aware that some of you already probably do this, but I'd like to get a yes or no here. So if you would go ahead and answer the poll. All right. Okay, so it's about even. We have people who would say yes and say no. I guess a more informal, and this is not part of the poll, but a more informal follow-up that I'd like you to at least think about is, would you be as comfortable delivering a presentation in a second language as you would be in your native language? So, of course, delivering a presentation can be nerve-wracking, even in your native language. We all get nervous to an extent. When you add a different language and most likely different cultures into the mix, it can become even more challenging. This can affect the presenter's confidence, and with confidence being a key point in foreign language usage, can lead to a presenter not getting the results that they are aiming for. I'd like to discuss presentations further and how they're tied to culture. In your mind, what makes a good presentation? Should it be interactive, dynamic, just stick to the facts? Should the presenter's recommendation be brought up in the introduction and then supported by facts, or vice versa? Should audience members be able to ask questions throughout the presentation, or only at the end, or not at all? While personal and corporate culture definitely come into play in the answers to these questions, the local culture is also a large factor. Having worked in Mexico, which is actually seen by many in Latin and South America as very similar to the US, I can tell you that the expectations for presentations there are actually quite different than in the US. Many of my BBCS participants would translate their presentation style literally when presenting in English, and they were finding that it wasn't giving them, exactly what they were hoping for in results. For example, in Spanish, the presenters would often use words such as maybe, probably, I think, and perhaps when trying to persuade their audience. While this works in their culture and in their language, it would be seen as very doubtful language to be using when persuading in the US and in English. So changing the word choice to reflect these cultural differences led to much quicker persuasion and buy-in with their American colleagues. Another point that I've worked on with many participants is how to effectively handle a Q&A session after a presentation. For example, in Mexico, it's very uncommon for the audience to ask questions after a presentation. If anyone would, it would be the boss. Otherwise, someone might ask the presenter afterward in a more one-on-one environment. The very fact that many attendees would be open to asking questions could surprise a presenter. And the additional challenges of the language and different cultural expectations makes it even more complicated. In fact, I had a participant in BBCS here in the US who had been living here for nearly 15 years and asked me, how should I answer a question after a presentation if I don't know the answer? What should I say? And what is seen as a bad answer? I can guarantee you that he had had that question for 15 years, but wasn't comfortable asking his coworkers. So together, we worked on best practices in regards to answering questions he didn't know the answers to, so that he appeared comfortable and confident, but of course was also honest. These are some of the aspects we look at when working with BBCS participants on presentations. But as you're all aware, it's not only language and word choice that is important in delivering a presentation. We also work with our participants on vocal and visual communication, which can be quite different from culture to culture. The last thing we want to do is completely change someone's behavior when presenting and make them uncomfortable. But we can give them feedback and work with them to meet their audience halfway in order to remain comfortable but also compelling while meeting that audience's cultural expectations. So this brings us to our third poll question. And I would like to ask you, have you ever judged the skill level of a coworker based on their English communication skills or English language level? This could also apply to other languages too, so it doesn't just have to be English. But go ahead and answer yes, no, or maybe. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. All right. So yes at 44%, maybe at 25%, and then no at 31%. So of course, we probably don't mean to judge them by any means, but sometimes it does make an impression at the very least, right? So non-native speakers are of course skilled workers. They want to be able to convey their expertise in their area, but they need to be able to communicate those abilities and remain credible. And that's really what we're working on in BBCS. The participants are the ones with expertise, and we're just coaching them on the communication side so that they're able to convey that and remain, credible, which is obviously essential. So as I mentioned before, our BBCS program is letting participants apply their language skills developed in other programs. But here what we're really doing is fine-tuning their communication skills. So what exactly do we mean by communication? In addition to vocal and visual, as I just mentioned, other points that we've found to be particularly useful in regards to communication for BBCS participants have been how to persuade and get buy-in from the audience or from management, as I mentioned earlier. And also, when and how to use diplomatic language is a key point that can be quite tricky, but also quite useful to work on. For example, how do you politely disagree with your boss? How do you propose an alternative to what was suggested by a coworker? And on the other end of the spectrum, when and how should we be more direct? What does that sound like? And how do we find that balance between being clear while not offending, but also not adding too many extra words that confuse the message? These are all tricky situations, even in our native language and native culture. So we can't expect that expats are automatically comfortable with this. Through simulations of these situations, followed by very specific feedback from their trainer, BBCS participants are able to internalize these communication strategies and over time become more independent and successful in implementing them. As I alluded to earlier, we offer many different modules for our participants based on their needs. A typical program of BBCS is 36 hours, and based on a needs analysis with the client, we select the modules that would be most relevant to their day-to-day business communication challenges. Our most commonly taken module is presentations, as many of us are nervous presenting in our native language, let alone in a second or third language. Another very popular module is virtual communication. Even participants with very high levels of English seem to get nervous without that visual communication aspect to rely on. And this is something we work with them on. Since 47% of the global workforce currently has a flexible work arrangement that is leading to more and more virtual communication, this can only become even more relevant going forward. Leadership and management communication explore delivering feedback to direct reports, communicating up and down the hierarchy, and communicating with your team. Throughout these modules, the BBCS trainer and participants discuss best practices, communication strategies, expressions and key language to utilize, and then participants are given the opportunity to simulate these situations using their personal work context. For example, bringing in a presentation that they're going to deliver, or bringing one in that they weren't successful on that they'd like to get more successful with for the future. So just as I mentioned earlier, when discussing the Berlitz Method, we want to keep this as relevant and realistic as possible in order to engage our participants, as well as to provide them with the relevant tools that they can use in the office right after their business communication session. So I've spoken quite a bit about BBCS, but Berlitz and TMC, of course, have other solutions in our portfolio that can address your employees' language and cultural competency needs. In our language lessons, we always strive to incorporate the relevant cultural insights that can support students. For example, if a student comes with us to learn Spanish and will be doing business with various countries, we can provide a team of instructors that represent those countries so that they become accustomed to the accents, local vocabulary, as well as cultural information related to the language that our instructors can provide. As those of you who speak Spanish, either as a native or second language know, Spanish varies greatly from country to country, and these insights can be quite useful in making the right impression. For example, in Mexico, in order to check that your message was clear, one might ask, ¿Me explico?, which would translate to, am I explaining myself clearly? I had a Colombian colleague in Mexico who would instead say, ¿Me entiendes?, or do you understand me?, which was seen by Mexican colleagues as being very condescending, which it wasn't meant to be. Providing our students with this type of information will lower the risk of being misunderstood and or being perceived as rude. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Cultural Navigator, which is a great resource in preparing for business interactions with people from other cultures. For example, a country-to-country gap analysis could provide someone from Japan an insight as to the similarities and differences between the two cultures, specifically in their thinking, sense of self, and interaction styles. The gap analysis report can also be useful in comparing communication styles between two countries that speak the same language. Whether you're a native speaker of English or not, this can help you prepare with how to convey your message more appropriately. For example, direct versus indirect communication. The same applies to non-English speaking countries as well. For example, as you can see here, Chile has a more direct communication style than Mexico. A student learning Spanish could incorporate this information into their language lessons, or BBCS program, in order to be effective in business interactions with both cultures. This brings us to the end of my section of this webinar for now, but I hope this information regarding language, culture, and the solutions available to further those skills and understanding has been useful to you. For those of you interested in more information regarding any of the solutions mentioned today, we'll be sending it along with access to this webinar's recording in our post-webinar email. Right now, I'd like to hand it over to Ken for final remarks, and then it'll be followed by the question and answer session.
Thanks, Jeff. So with this, I'd like to say thank you. Join us for other webinars in this series being held monthly from now until the end of the year. Right now, we have scheduled 2 webinars. We'll share this listing with upcoming webinars with email along with this recording. But you'll see 2 here on Wednesday, May 20th on taking cultural agility to the next level with Bettina Neidhart, our client strategy consultant based in Europe. And on Wednesday, June 17th, we'll have another webinar on developing cultural competence at the college and university level, utilizing the Cultural Navigator. Our other client strategy consultant based in the U.S., Dan Kerr, and Tara Madden-Dent will be talking about this particular topic, which is very, very relevant today in terms of college students and MBA students integrating cultural competence into their curriculum. I'd like to thank you for your time today, and we hope this webinar has been a value add to you in understanding how the Cultural Navigator can help you with language learning and cultural competence, and looking how the two are integrated in working and helping people be more effective both at the individual, team, and organizational level to achieve their business results.